The incident that would later unsettle a generation of Soviet nuclear engineers began, as many Cold War crises did, with something deceptively ordinary: a blackout. On a winter evening in the late 1960s, as winds rolled across the industrial districts surrounding a restricted design bureau in the Urals, a sudden fluctuation on the power grid cut electricity to several research blocks. For most scientists, it was an inconvenience. For a small team of American intelligence officers who had spent months studying Soviet electrical patterns, it was the window they had been waiting for. By the late 1960s, the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons program was expansive but uneven. It possessed extraordinary theoretical scientists, yet its industrial systems lagged behind. Design bureaus relied on aging electrical infrastructure, overstretched substations, and patchwork wiring that regularly produced maintenance outages. What the Soviets saw as an internal nuisance, the CIA saw as a predictable vulnerability. For years, American reconnaissance, both satellite and human, had mapped the rhythms of these facilities. When lights dimmed, when generators took over, when guards tightened or relaxed, analysts at Langley knew that outages created blind spots in perimeter cameras and disrupted the electromagnetic shielding that normally protected sensitive laboratories. But the opportunity would have meant nothing without access. That part of the operation had been built quietly through the CIA's long-term cultivation of technical personnel in satellite industries: electricians, contractors, delivery drivers servicing state institutes. These individuals were not spies in the cinematic sense, but ordinary workers whose routes occasionally brought them near secure zones. From them, the CIA pieced together the bureaucratic routines surrounding the design bureau maintenance schedules, delivery manifests, generator inspection times, and the specific transformers prone to overload during winter. On the night of the outage, those estimates aligned perfectly. As secondary generators clicked on, surveillance cameras cycled irregularly, creating intermittent gaps of 30 to 90 seconds. Interior corridors reverted to minimal lighting powered by emergency circuits. And deep inside the complex, a small drafting room that normally housed sensitive weapons component blueprints lost its reinforced power feed entirely, leaving only a single emergency fixture glowing faintly above the tables. This environment, darkened corridors, shifting guard routes, impaired sensors, was precisely the condition U.S. planners had modeled. It offered neither a long window nor a dramatic breach, but a narrow technical opportunity. Enough time to duplicate key schematics without disturbing their order. And that opening leads directly into how the CIA prepared an operation designed to exploit a moment the Soviets themselves viewed as routine. To understand how the CIA positioned itself to act decisively during that brief blackout, it's necessary to look at the slow, methodical groundwork that preceded it. Contrary to popular imagination, Cold War intelligence successes were rarely the work of sudden inspiration or bold intrusions. They were usually the product of patient study, exhaustive pattern analysis, and an unglamorous familiarity with the mechanical routines inside Soviet institutions. The design bureau in question, one responsible for component refinements in warhead physics packages, was not among the most famous Soviet nuclear centers like Artemis 16 or Chelyabinsk 70. It was a mid-tier technical bureau tasked with machining tolerances, tamper geometry, and intermediate-stage engineering. That made it valuable in a different way. Its work fed into the final assembly at higher security institutes, and its draftsmen handled blueprints that documented manufacturing parameters for critical nuclear components. CIA analysts had spent years reconstructing the bureaucratic flow of documents inside such facilities. Through defectors, trade show observations, and open-source Soviet technical manuals, they developed a picture of how blueprints moved, from senior physicists downward to metallurgists, then to drafters who converted theoretical designs into engineering drawings. These drawings, often on large format sheets with specifications written in meticulous block lettering, were archived in small drafting rooms overseen by mid-level engineers rather than top clearance physicists. Those drafting rooms were secured, but not absolutely. Soviet security doctrine placed the greatest emphasis on theoretical materials, mathematical models, and high-yield weapon designs. Intermediate engineering was considered sensitive but not existential. This classification hierarchy created gaps. Rooms that were locked and monitored, but not guarded with the same intensity found in primary nuclear institutes. The CIA had learned this discrepancy during technical exchanges with Western physicists who had worked alongside or corresponded with their Soviet counterparts. The American side understood that the Soviets tended to overprotect theory and underprotect fabrication. Months before the outage, signals intelligence had captured fluctuations in the Bureau's electrical grid during winter storms. Patterns emerged. Transformer number 3 tripped repeatedly under load, emergency generators momentarily desynchronized, and security cameras rebooted on their own circuits. CIA planners cross-referenced those incidents with limited human accounts from workers who remembered which hallways darkened first and how quickly guards responded. By late autumn, a model emerged, one showing that a winter failure of Transformer 3 would briefly disable power to the exact drafting room that handled the printed blueprints of interest. And crucially, the emergency lighting in that room illuminated the tables but not the wall-mounted cameras. That analysis set the stage for the precise moment the CIA had long anticipated. What made the blackout usable was not simply the darkness, but the CIA's ability to place the right personnel inside Soviet logistical channels long before it occurred. Contrary to popular myth, the United States did not insert saboteurs into nuclear facilities. Such an operation would have been implausible and easily exposed. Instead, the CIA exploited the vast ecosystem surrounding Soviet research complexes. Repair crews, technical clerks, custodial workers, and contracted maintenance staff, many of whom moved through semi-secure zones without attracting attention. Through years of indirect recruitment and information exchange, American intelligence had identified individuals whose legitimate duties occasionally brought them close to the Bureau's support infrastructure. None of them handled sensitive documents. They didn't need to. What they provided were details the CIA could not obtain through satellites. Which doors stuck in winter, how long guards took to reset circuit breakers, which hallways were used during fire drills, and which stairwells were considered low priority during inspections. The most significant contribution came from a technician responsible for maintaining electrical panels in adjacent administrative buildings. He had no access to classified rooms, yet his routine reports, forwarded through intermediaries, allowed analysts to map the quirks of the aging electrical system. He noted that certain emergency lights flickered when the main feed collapsed, that backup generators warmed unevenly, and that the surge from transformer resets caused temporary interference in older security cameras. None of this was dramatic, but each detail fed into a broader operational model. Satellite imagery reinforced what human sources suggested. Thermal readings taken during previous outages showed that emergency generators activated in a staggered sequence, restoring power unevenly across the complex. Infrared imagery revealed which sections heated first, useful for predicting which rooms would regain functionality quickly and which would remain dim. Even data gathered from the direction and duration of smoke plumes during chimney cleaning days gave clues about which backup systems were in use. When these disparate pieces were compiled, analysts realized something unique. The drafting room holding the nuclear component blueprints would be among the last areas to regain full electrical stability. This meant the cameras inside would reboot slower, and the lighting would remain minimal. More importantly, the blueprints were stored flat on large tables, not in safes, because the room's classification level was lower than the theoretical physics labs. This combination, predictable darkness, slow camera resets, and exposed documents, created a narrow operational corridor. But exploiting it required a presence inside the building that wouldn't raise suspicions, and that is where the CIA's most subtle asset came into focus. The CIA's access was not the cinematic infiltration often imagined in Cold War retellings. It relied instead on a principle well understood within intelligence circles, that the most effective assets are those who appear entirely unremarkable. In this case, the key individual was a maintenance custodian whose duties involved cleaning administrative corridors, replacing bulbs, transporting drafting materials, and reporting minor facility issues. He was employed by a civilian service bureau, not the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, meaning he carried a lower-level pass, sufficient for routine movement, insufficient for entry into secure vaults. But the drafting room, while sensitive, was not a vault. It was a workspace, and workspaces required cleaning. Years earlier, the CIA had identified him as a possible asset through a pattern common in Soviet service industries. Workers rotated between government buildings, occasionally receiving assignments in research facilities without being told their full significance. His recruitment was not motivated by ideology. It was facilitated through quiet financial incentives and the promise of discreet assistance with bureaucratic issues that affected his family. Common factors in the USSR's strained economic climate. What mattered was reliability and consistency, not access. For months leading up to the outage, his role was strictly observational. He reported nothing that compromised classified material. That was neither his instruction nor his capability. Instead, he relayed procedural details. Which supervisors stayed late, which drafting tables were used for long-term projects, how documents were typically covered or left open during shift changes, and the cadence of guard patrols during maintenance evenings. The CIA used these observations to refine its timing model, ensuring that no action would be taken unless conditions aligned precisely. When the blackout struck, his presence inside the building did not appear unusual. Custodial staff were often called upon to help set up emergency lighting, notify supervisors about power conditions, or assist in clearing hallways. Under generator illumination, movement through semi-dark corridors looked chaotic even to guards. The priority was restoring essential operations, not monitoring workers known for routine tasks. As cameras rebooted and emergency lights flickered, the custodian carried out instructions that had been prepared long in advance. He would enter the drafting room only after the second generator started, never before, and only if the guard's initial sweep had already passed. His task was to confirm that the blueprints were indeed left on the central table, as was typical during winter work cycles. What followed was not improvisation but the carefully choreographed execution of a plan that depended on minutes, not hours. What made the operation viable was not the custodian's presence in the drafting room, but the equipment he carried, tools that, on their own, appeared indistinguishable from ordinary Soviet institutional supplies. Nothing was smuggled in. Nothing exotic was imported. The CIA had long mastered the art of embedding Western-made micro-optical instruments inside objects that passed easily through Soviet procurement channels. In this case, the device was concealed within a standard clipboard issued to maintenance workers. A fiber-optic camera the size of a matchstick, powered by a silent microbattery and activated only when tilted at a specific angle. The custodian's job was not to photograph the documents himself. His role was to confirm conditions, determine whether the blueprints were laid out flat, and, most importantly, signal whether the emergency light was positioned so that reflective glare would not obscure critical specifications. When he stepped back into the corridor, he left the door ajar by less than a centimeter. This minuscule gap was the trigger for the next phase. The entry of a second asset who had been waiting inside a storage alcove cleared during the initial power inspection. This second individual, a technical worker with approvals for equipment repair, carried what outwardly resembled a canvas tool roll. Inside it were 2 folded sheets of plain drafting paper coated with ultra-thin Western-produced microfilm capture material. Unlike cameras, which risked visible flashes or audible clicks under generator lighting, the microfilm sheets relied on brief, controlled exposure, contact copying the blueprints at near-perfect fidelity when pressed flush against the originals. This method, adapted from earlier intelligence operations in Eastern Europe, allowed entire engineering drawings, including notations, tolerances, and metallurgical codes, to be duplicated silently. He entered only after a generator surge caused cameras to momentarily freeze, a predictable occurrence documented in previous outages. With practiced efficiency, he laid the microfilm sheet atop the first blueprint, weighted it with an innocuous drafting ruler, and held it in place for only a few seconds. The emergency light provided just enough illumination for the capture layer to register the ink without overexposing the lines. He repeated the procedure across several sheets that detailed explosive lens machining, tamper alloy preparations, and internal support structures, documents that collectively revealed manufacturing processes rather than theoretical warhead physics. Each blueprint was returned precisely to its original orientation. Nothing was moved, nothing left askew. When the cameras resumed normal cycling, he had already slipped back into the storage alcove, leaving behind no trace other than the faint chemical signature embedded invisibly within the microfilm sheets, now hidden inside the tool roll. What happened next would determine whether the CIA's achievement remained a silent triumph or a disaster discovered at morning inspection. Extraction was always the most vulnerable stage of any intelligence operation, and this one was no exception. The microfilm sheets were transferred out of the facility not through heroic escape, but through the design of Soviet bureaucracy itself. Maintenance tool rolls were not inspected at shift's end. They were considered mundane equipment belonging to civilian service units. The sheets were concealed among replacement gaskets and dull drill bits, items so common that guards rarely lifted them. By dawn, the assets had returned to their assigned posts, and when full power was restored, the drafting room appeared exactly as it had the night before. In the weeks that followed, U.S. analysts processed the captured specifications, gaining insight into Soviet machining tolerances, explosive lens casting, and quality control revisions. Nothing in the building had ever appeared disturbed. The Soviet scientists continued their work, unaware that a brief winter blackout had opened a window through which their most guarded engineering details quietly passed into foreign hands.